All right, everybody. Hello and welcome today. This is one of the Oregon State Capitol Foundation speaker series. I'm Joan Plank. I'm with the Oregon State Capitol Foundation. And today we have Floyd McKay, journalist, a familiar face in the Capitol for over 2 decades. He's going to be talking about his book, Reporting the Oregon Story, How Activists and Visionaries Transformed a State, and about his time covering the Capitol. The book is for sale in the Capitol gift shop and or Capitol store. It's called now, not the gift shop, the Capitol store. And Mr. McKay will be signing his book after today's talk right next to the store, and we'll have some coffee and refreshments. So with that, Floyd McKay, thank you.
Well, this is a little bit like my life on television. There's people out there that I can't see, but I did that for many years, and so I'm hoping that they'll stay with me. I apologize in advance. When I come to Oregon, I pick up an allergy. I don't know what it is, but I immediately need to use my handkerchief, but I guess there were times in the past when I probably had to do that for other reasons. Well, the Capitol is a wonderful place for me to come back to. It was actually kind of my home for about 2 decades, actually. A very long time, and very many changes in this building during that time. Jason Bowe did his work, and we had the Bowe wings, and I see now that one of those wings is named for Phil Lang, so that's all good. It's good to be back here. When I first came in 1964, the press room in those days was kind of in a widened corridor between the coffee shop and the House of Representatives elevator. And so we huddled down in that widened corridor and badgered the members as they went by and picked up our stories here and there. There's a different press room now and certainly a different set of reporters, but it's all very important stuff. 1964 was a good time for me and a good time for Oregon, and I was named at age 28 to come to the Capitol for the Oregon Statesman as the political reporter. This was really one of the best journalism jobs in the state at that time for several reasons. If you're the political reporter in the state capitol, almost every one of your readers has a connection. Someone in their family works for the state, they sell things for the state, they deal with state all the time. So I automatically had an audience that cared about what I was writing, and that's a good thing. It was also a time when the Oregon Statesman was a very prominent voice in the state of Oregon, in large part because of the stature of Charles A. Sprague, who was the editor and publisher until his death in 1969. And he was probably the leading elder statesman for the Republican side of the aisle during that period. So when you worked for Sprague and you went to the Capitol, you immediately had stature that you would not have otherwise had as a very green 28-year-old. 1964 was the year that I have set as my book end for this book that I have written, Reporting the Oregon Story. The Oregon Story, as I understand it and interpret it, began in 1964 with the election of Tom McCall and Bob Straub to their first statewide office. And immediately as they came in, they had people around them who were interested and cared about moving forward in a different direction than had been the situation for a number of years. Mark Hatfield was a very prominent governor, a very efficient governor, but most of his emphasis was in a good administration, efficiency, and promoting the state economy. And he did a good job on those things, but the environmental side of things was not a priority with him. It wasn't a priority basically for any of us. We didn't even know the term environmentalism until 1962 with Rachel Carson's Silent Spring. That may have started the environmental movement. In Oregon, the environmental movement may very well have started the same year with Tom McCall's documentary for KGW, pollution in paradise. It also made Tom's reputation as a serious journalist. He'd been kind of, a guy who was a good journeyman reporter and that sort of thing, but nothing out of the ordinary. This put him in a different league, and it helped him during his time as governor. Well, I came here as a small-town guy. I was raised on a farm, didn't have a big fancy education, and I'd had very little time. So I needed to learn Oregon when I came to the Capitol. And, what better place to learn Oregon than in the Capitol, where you've got this wonderful array of legislators from all around the state, places where you've maybe never even been, but they can certainly tell you about them. I want to read just briefly a little piece from the book in which I talk about the context of 1964. Quoting, Oregon was still a neighborhood in 1964. People could and did walk up to a governor or a senator in a public space and express an opinion. State legislators answered their own phones and email. And email, I did it, didn't I? Their own phones and mail. Their campaign costs were a fraction of today's slick media productions. Major employers and nearly all the media were owned within the Pacific Northwest. The boss lived in the neighborhood. Oregon was their home, not a stop on the way to another high-end suburb in another state. Scale is important in any endeavor, be it a business, local or federal government, university or industry. The larger we grow, the more we lose the neighborhood. Oregon's population in 1960 was only 1.7 million people. By 2015, we were home to 4 million. And the neighborhood had become a city. In 1964, we retained the can-do attitude of the war that Americans fought and won, as well as an implicit trust in our elected leaders. Oh, we bitched about some of their decisions, and we told them so, but we believed them. We wished them well, and if it didn't cost too much, we followed their lead. Reporters in general were no different than their audience in this regard. We were all in the same middle-class neighborhood. The Oregon story was made possible because of the people and the way they were able to work together. But this, in turn, was enabled because the challenges we faced were easily understood by citizens, and there was general agreement that our natural heritage needed help. In the case of the Oregon story, the challenges we faced were there before our very eyes, or our noses. We could smell the Willamette. We needed no further evidence. A new house overlooked our picnic spot at the beach as we piled a log on the bonfire. The legacy of the Oregon story is seen in our physical spaces: clean waters, open beaches, trails without litter, urban neighborhoods, and thriving farms and vineyards. These icons were created by not-so-ordinary citizens willing to challenge conventional wisdom and take to the streets and beaches on their own time and their own dime. Neighborhood schools, beaches, and rivers prospered from the efforts of activists, predominantly women and often immigrants from other places. The Oregon story was built on an important progression of activism. Local people start the process. A beachcomber, a fisherman, a hiker in the Columbia Gorge, a couple with kids in school, and the process widens to neighbors and others of similar persuasion. Political leaders awaken, and the circle widens until together they create a movement that legislators and city councils cannot ignore. Next thing you know, there is an Oregon story. Well, the Oregon story then, to repeat, is one of salvaging and preserving our heritage. Oregon had been under a lot of pressure during World War II and shortly thereafter with growth. People moving here, we had new industries, we had a boom in timber and some of our traditional industries. And what was happening was that we were slow to understand that there was a price to be paid for this, for the growth and for the type of harvesting we're doing and what the pressures we were putting particularly on our rivers. And so finally we began to awaken to that, and that became a large part of the Oregon story. This is the 50th anniversary this year of the Oregon Beach Bill, and many of you have heard that, and we'll be having some celebrations later on. The Oregon story really began on the waters. Tom McCall's documentary on Pollution in Paradise began the movement to clean up the Willamette. And it was one of his legacies, is that we did, in fact, clean up the Willamette. You could finally swim in it. Prior to that, if you fell off your boat, you were in bad shape. The other part of the waters, if you will, was the beaches. And it was a twofold approach to the beaches that got us moving in what we call the Oregon story. And the first one, ironically, was an issue in which Tom McCall and Bob Straub were on different sides of the issue. The Oregon Highway Commission in 1964-65 was certainly the most powerful citizen agency in the state of Oregon. We were in love with the automobile after being unable during World War II to buy a new one. And everyone wanted to drive everywhere. A lot of them like to drive on the beaches, too. And the highway department, the engineers in the highway department, saw something that engineers always love. They saw a straight line. You all know the Oregon 101. It's a little curvy in spots, and it was even more curvy in spots in those days. And so they decided to start widening the highway, and everybody cheered. And then they decided that they would straighten it between Nescoin and Pacific City, and it would be really easy to do. We could just drive it up to a point called Porter Point, and then you drop it on a big bridge down to the sand at Pacific City, and that would be cool. And everyone in state government, including at that time Tom, who was Secretary of State, and everyone at the local level, including county commissioners, mayors, and businessmen, thought this was just a great idea. The people who had homes or cabins at Pacific City didn't think it was a great idea, but they were told to go someplace else, please. Well, they didn't go someplace else, except they went to see Bob Straub, who was getting ready to run for governor against Tom McCall, who everyone assumed would be governor. After all, he was Secretary of State. Isn't that what always happened to Secretaries of State? Well, Bob took up with these folks, and they organized, among other things, a Mother's Day March, which was one of the early activist movements that I talk a lot about in my book. And took him 3 years, actually, to beat that highway back, but he did, and he won. In many ways, people getting involved in that particular fight meant that they were already thinking about the beaches and about preservation of this resource by the time we got to what we call now the Beach Bill. The Beach Bill happened because developers, of course, were looking at ways to make money on the Oregon coast, and they very wisely figured if you could fence off the sand and charge people to enter it, you'd probably do pretty well. And so they started to do that. Fell up at Cannon Beach, built himself a nifty little fence down to the beach and said private property. And holy cow, I mean, we all grew up there going to the beach and parking and going down and building a bonfire and having a hell of a good time. And people didn't try to charge admission to go there. So there was an immediate reaction to it. The bill to fix this, the lawyers found out that, these guys maybe had a point. The original law from the 1920s had some loopholes in it that we hadn't realized until we started getting all this growth in the post-war period. More pressure on the resource. So they decided that they needed to have a little housekeeping bill to fix this. Legislators will know the term little housekeeping bill is one you ought to watch out for. And so they introduced a bill, they called it House Bill 1601. And immediately, sides began to form. There were people who could see that we needed this. There were also people, particularly developers and property owners on the Oregon coast, who figured, whoa, wait a minute, this was the good chance to make some real money. And then, of course, there's always the argument over private property rights. People don't always agree on how much is private and what the public has a right to. Well, it got pretty contentious. It got stalled in committee. And the chairman of the committee, a guy named Sid Bassett, couldn't get it out of the committee. They had the votes on the House floor, but it was stuck. So Tom McCall got into the act. And he organized what I call a media scrum at the beach. He invaded the Cannon Beach area with buses and helicopters and stuff like that to take press people and others who were interested down there. And he walked the beach and scowled at the fences and the whole thing. And he had wonderful props. He had some oceanographers and engineers, and there were transits, and there were all sorts of things going on. And the simple fact of the matter is that it was a made-for-media delight. And television at that time was really just beginning to come into its dominant period in Oregon. The other element in it, and it ties in with this, is that a man named Ansel Payne, who was the station manager at KGW-TV, got on the air and delivered a blistering editorial telling Oregon citizens that they, by gosh, had to get on the horn and save their beaches. Write or phone your legislator. 40,000 people did. I mean, this sounds like social media. 40,000 people the old-fashioned way. And the combination of Tom's big effort at the beach and Ansel Payne's editorial broke the deadlock in the House and gave us the beach bill. Well, things moved on from that, and we began to look at other things that we felt we needed to do something about. And so we began the other chapters that I call the Oregon story. We cleaned up the Willamette. We developed something that Bob Straub and Tom McCall both supported, called the Willamette Greenway, which has also produced public access to this wonderful river that is now clean enough for people to use. Other things began to happen. Governor Hatfield was closing off 8 years of his very popular governorship, running for the U.S. Senate, and got mixed up in the Vietnam War. The chapter in the book that I talk about this, I say, Mark goes rogue. Hatfield at that time was a very popular Republican on a national level. He was considered a moderate, but he could speak to both wings of the party, and he didn't take a lot of chances. Suddenly, he became the first governor in all 50 states to oppose Lyndon Johnson's policies in the Vietnam War. This then brought Senator Wayne Morse into the fray. Excuse me. Morse had already made his name as the major opponent of Johnson at the time of the Tonkin Gulf resolution. The two of them made a very, very unlikely combination, to say the least. A Democrat and a Republican, but so different in so many ways. And suddenly Oregon was in the national news again, this time because of Vietnam. And then to add to the fun, in 1970, the Vietnam War figured again in Oregon when the American Legion decided to hold its national convention in Portland, invited President Nixon, who else, and a lot of people who didn't like the Legion or President Nixon decided to come and trash it. The FBI believed there was a serious threat there. Some other police agencies did too. Tom McCall and his advisors got together and threw a rock festival for the. Rock festival was very popular at that time. It was the era of Woodstock, and so they said if we could just draw the young people who would be the fodder for these demonstrations, draw them out of the city of Portland, they could have a good time. So they created what I call the world's first ever state-sponsored rock and drug festival at McIver Park out in Clackamas County. And kids came by the thousands, maybe 30,000 total. They had a good time. A lot of them wandered around without their clothes. They had drugs, they had alcohol, and they had a hell of a time, and no one got hurt, either at McIver or downtown. And suddenly Tom McCall was a national figure, and he easily won re-election, and we moved on. Well, we've done so many other things since that time, but those things were typical of the way Oregon was approaching this fascinating and sometimes very chaotic period of the 1970s and 1980s. At the same time, Portland began creating what I call the Portland Renaissance. The foundations were laid for what is really today one of the nation's most attractive cities, and we did it again. Shades of the highway department, we did it by stopping 3 urban freeways and using that land for something else. In the case of Tom McCall Memorial Park, we closed off the freeway right on the Willamette downtown. We closed off something called the Mount Hood Freeway, which would have never gone near Mount Hood, and saved a large urban neighborhood. We did those things, and it was just typical of what was going on during this time. I don't want to describe anymore. I want you to buy the book and find out what else was going on. But I do want to emphasize the role of activists and legislators, and I want to emphasize in particular the rising role of women during this period. This was a time when we began to see a new generation of female leaders. Norma Paulus and Betty Roberts, bipartisan, to pass the ERA and lead the feminist movement at that time. Then that led to Vera Katz and later Barbara Roberts, the sort of people that we now take for granted, but were somewhat unusual at that time. So what I want to do here now, because I want to keep within my time limits and everything, I'd like to close off my my formal comments. Just a minute. That's that Oregon allergy again. And take questions from the audience. And there are several people in here I know have opinions. I'll try to ignore you. No, I won't at all. And let's see what people want to talk about, and then our audience on online or streaming can get the benefit of your questions. So let's start with that. Yes.
So the era that you talk about, do you view it as sort of a one-off golden age of Oregon activism, or can you identify today some personalities or movements that you see that echo that, have the same flavor?
That's a really good question. The question is whether I view this period, the Oregon story, as kind of a one-off, or do I see possibilities of today or at other times of which Oregon has really had the leadership to do what was done during that time. I would say yes and no. Clearly, it was a one-off. I don't think that any other period in Oregon history compares to it in terms of activism creating major policies and legislation. But that doesn't mean we can't do other very serious legislation, very serious policies to deal with today's problems. Our environment is in pretty decent shape in Oregon now, but the problems we have today, I think, are much more difficult to solve. You start talking about income inequity, you start talking about homelessness and the problem of trying to finance a school system that is dealing with much more difficult educational issues than we dealt with in the 1970s. And it's very difficult to negotiate some of the agreements across party lines and across urban versus rural lines than we did in the 1970s. I don't know the leaders in Oregon anymore. I'm sorry. We've been living in Bellingham, Washington for 25 years now. I went up there to teach, and we stayed. Our families are still here, and they're prospering in this great state. And I still know a few of the players, but not very many. I'm impressed with the new generation of activists among the millennial generation. And I don't mean the people who are going out and trashing a public demonstration or creating some sort of a violent confrontation. That is such a fringe element. I mean the kids who got together, well, the Bernieistas in the presidential election. In both states, young millennials have been behind efforts to shut down fossil fuels and deal with climate change. I think there's a lot of promise in this generation, and I think they've set their goals and priorities in the right places. I'm very, very encouraged. I think we still need leadership. We always need leadership, but this is a group that's ready to perform. I think I'm very, very encouraged by it.
So on that note, thank you for saying that. On that note, what sorts of additional comments or advice would you have? Maybe what do you think is important for young millennials in the political world to know about Oregon's history or broader lessons moving forward?
What advice or counsel would I have for young millennials who want to make these kinds of changes? Well, I think it's much the same as what worked in the 1970s. Organize. Organize, organize, organize. It sounds like the old labor call of the 1930s. But the simple fact of the matter is, you got to stay with it. You've got to stay with it. I was encouraged by the Women's March after the 2016 election was over. I've been encouraged by some of the other actions that has said, wait a minute, we're not going to go back. We're not going to go back, but you have to stay organized. Understand, I think also, that our region, the nation as a whole, is split along many lines, and one of the lines that a lot of people don't adequately recognize is the urban-rural split. I'm consistently impressed by how important that is in where I'm living now in Washington State, and also in Oregon. I mean, we did a couple book events in Bend the other day, and I'm thinking, where does Bend fall into the demographic picture of Oregon now? And if it's changing as fast as people say it is, fastest growing city in the country last year, apparently. What does that mean to the rest of Central and Eastern Oregon? And, another major city there, a very different type of city than the other small cities there. So I think that millennials have a tendency to center on the urban areas. That's where the jobs are. That's where a lot of the excitement is, let's face it. But you can't remember some of the roots of the people. You can't forget some of the roots that sent those millennials there. What's happened to the town where you grew up on? Can you do things to try to bring them closer together with your generation? That's part of the organizing, but it's also part of being compassionate and remembering that there's people who very sincerely are not with you on some of these things.
You mentioned 1964 as the getting one book in. I didn't catch what the other book was.
I list as the other book. Someone asked if 1964 was the beginning of the Oregon story. What was the conclusion? Well, for my book, it's 1986. Now, it just so happens that's the year I stopped reporting, but that truly, it truly is a coincidence, because I think that in 1986 we passed the last of the major policies that form what I call the Oregon story, and that was the Columbia River Gorge Scenic Area. Big battle. Took about 3 years to get that done, and it was the epitome of the citizen activist movement. A woman named Nancy Russell just simply would not give up, and she kept plugging away. She got all sorts of sponsorship and everything, and finally Ronald Reagan, of all people, signed the bill to create the National Scenic Area. He hadn't wanted to do it. It ran against all his ideas about federal control over local and everything. But he found himself in a box because he really needed Mark Hatfield, who was the chairman of the Senate Appropriations Committee. And Mark really wanted the bill, and he got it.
Follow up on. So I was curious what you saw as the influence of the business community when you started and when you finished.
The influence of the business community, yeah, big difference. In 1964 and through the 1960s and the 70s, the ownership of important businesses was local, and the people lived here. I'm talking about, everyone remembers Glenn Jackson, of course, the chairman of the Highway Commission, chairman of Pacific Power, and all this sort of thing. But there were every community seemed to have someone like that. Over in Prineville, it was Les Schwab. Up in Beaverton and Portland, it was Howard Vollum. And you just go right down the road, and it was a guy who owned a big timber company, or someone who had, in Salem, the role played by Jerry Frank was very important. These people all lived here, and their kids and their families were here, and you could go down the hall and talk to them. That was a big part of my interest in staying at the Oregon Statesman for 10 years. Was the fact that Charles Sprague, the editor and publisher, lived here. He cared about it. He didn't have to send his profits off to Syracuse, New York, or someplace. And when he died in 1969, I figured that was probably going to be kind of the end of the Statesman as I knew it. They would sell it, and they did, and it was. Yeah, it made a huge difference. And the corporate owners of Oregon businesses and industries, by and large, are not local people. There are exceptions, of course, like Phil Knight and others you could name, but it's changed, and it does make a difference. I know when Portland was beginning to change and Neil Goldschmidt was trying to make the economic progress in Portland, and he went to Nordstrom's and talked those people into changing. Well, they're a Northwest family, and others in Portland that bought into the idea of bringing in new industry were people that had local roots, and there are still some of those people up there, the Columbia Sportswear people and others, in addition to Nike. Yeah.
Well, it just brought to memory that one of the things that I discovered, I used to review nursing homes in late 70s, middle 80s. And one of the things that I discovered is the best nursing homes in the state of Oregon were run by people who owned it, and they were local people. When we started having corporations coming in from Texas, different states in the nation, we discovered that care was going down the tubes, basically. And it's amazing.
I think it's one of the things that I mentioned in that opening reading. The comment is made that locally owned nursing homes were doing a pretty good job of taking care of people, and the more it became national chains and that sort of thing, the quality of the care went down. I think that quality of scale is enormously important. And I don't care whether it's a school or a factory or a government. The larger it gets, I've seen this happen at the university level when I went to teaching. All of a sudden you had a need there, and so they appointed a new vice president for XYZ. Well, the new vice president, of course, had to have an assistant. And the assistant had to have an assistant. Next thing you know, there's 10, 15 people walking around, and you know, a month before you didn't need any of them. And this kind of thing happens all too often, I think. I mean, it's good to have people have good jobs. I'm all for that, but there is a problem. So I think that this is one of our problems with media today, is not that they've got too many assistants. Lord knows they don't have too many people. Most of them are in a lot of reduction of force. But Oregon media is now primarily owned outside the region. When I first started working in the 1960s and here in Salem, we had two newspapers, both of them owned locally. The Oregonian was the only out-of-state chain, really, in the state of Oregon at that time. And the television stations were all owned within the Pacific Northwest. I worked for King Broadcasting when I was at KGW-TV. I took the job that Tom McCall had started out and continued in that for a number of years. But the simple fact of the matter is that the people who owned the stations watched the news. The people who edited those newspapers, by golly, you bet they read those newspapers. And it just makes so much difference, and the readers and the viewers could complain to them. You could walk in the door down at the Statesman, and Governor Sprague was in his office. I remember once someone coming in. He had an appointment with Sprague, and he came in, and he was told he had to wait for a little bit. So he sat down on a chair next to Sprague's office. There were a couple people waiting. He looked, the guy next to him was Walter Cronkite. We were all kind of equal in those days, and it was a pretty good deal. Yeah, you can't go back to that. I understand that. You can't go back to that. I don't know anyone who wants to buy a major urban newspaper today. I wish there were. Actually, Jeff Bezos, the Amazon guy, bought the Washington Post, and he's improved it. He's improved it. He's made it better. And I was skeptical. I thought, what's gonna happen here?
Another question. How do you see the presence, the Hispanic presence in the state of Oregon? I belong to a group. We have created a nonprofit. It's called the Instituto de Cultura Oregoniana, and we have been dealing with the sense of our identity living in this state. I am originally from Peru, and I've been here over 50 years. And we have started asking ourselves the question, am I Peruvian? And the answer that comes now among us, among the group when we meet, is that we are Oregonians. But we have a little a difference in the sense that we are bilingual, and we have certain flavors that distinguishes us a little bit, but makes us also part of this land that is now ours too. And we're trying to deal with those issues, especially now when I have found out, for example, that here in Salem, the student population among in the school district are, I think, approximately 50% of the student population is Hispanic.
Well, the question seems to be, how do we, if we are part of a community that has different economic or ethnic roots, how do we communicate properly in today's media environment? Well, I think it's probably a lot easier because of social media. It seems to be the fact that younger people in particular are using social media to a very high degree. And social media is uniquely suited to deal with discrete groups of people, discrete audiences. You don't have to draft a social media platform that includes everyone, because you can communicate with your own people. The problem is getting the outreach there to find these people and bring them in. And I think it's impossible for today's mass media, traditional what we call legacy media, to service a number of discrete communities. But social media will do that job, and I think definitely that's where it's going. Yeah, Dick.
Floyd, Tom McCall is revered these days, almost mythical, but as you talk about in your book, things were really difficult, and they didn't happen, naturally. Like people think that he just spoke all these things. What were the qualities of the Straub, the McCalls, the women you mentioned in your book, that enabled them to do those things?
Good question. What were the qualities of people like McCall and Straub and the women I previously mentioned to do what they did during this period of time? In part, they were enabled by each other. If I'm playing tennis, my game's better if I'm playing against someone who's pretty good. And I think that's true in the world of politics as well. If you've got people who are natural leaders or become natural leaders, you're working in an environment where you almost have to try to strive to do the same thing yourself. I don't think that either Tom McCall or Bob Straub were natural leaders. I think they were both cautious in their own way. Straub had a very difficult time communicating. He had a speech impediment that took him a while to get over. He had a terrible memory for names. And he was just not a natural politician. In the book, I have a little anecdote. When I began my reporting career in 1958, I was in Springfield, Oregon, working on the semi-weekly there. And I was all of 24 years old, and I went out to cover a guy named Bob Straub who was giving a speech at some Democratic meeting. I came back and I told my wife, I said, that guy's never going to go anywhere. In my certitude at age 24, I had decided that the guy had no future. Well, he did it a lot through hard work. He was a very bright guy also. Tom McCall had a wonderful ability to communicate. Communication is just so important for a politician. And I think more than any other thing, it was his ability to communicate. But it wasn't just his ability to communicate on television. It was his ability to communicate in small groups and with people. I mean, Tom was a natural ally of journalists because he was one, and he never forgot where he came from. I can remember being in a room with Tom and a bunch of important people and this sort of thing, and seeing Tom pull aside from people like that and walk over and talk to a reporter from a little newspaper or radio station. Not many politicians do that, but it was natural with him. So I think that they parlayed what they had, and in Tom's case, it was communication, and because they really felt very strongly about the state and about public service, and I think that was the case with all of the people that really had leadership during this time. The women who came to prominence during this period, people like Betty Roberts and Norma Paulus, found a cause in the feminist movement that overrode their partisanship. I mean, these were partisan people. You got into a fight with Betty or Norma or Vera Katz or someone like that. You knew you were in a battle against someone who strongly believed. But they found in the cause of advancing the feminist agenda during this period, found something that would bridge the normal partisan gap. And they got all the women in the legislature to support the ERA. And there were some very conservative women, even at that time, in the Oregon legislature. And they came together under this. And that ability to bring people together, I think, is awfully important. These were all mature people. They were not young. Some of them have been through World War II, case of Tom and Bob Straub and Mark Hatfield in particular. But they were mature people who knew that they had to bridge gaps, and they did it. Everyone had their own talents and skills.
Yeah, first off, I did read your book in sex notes, so I commend you on that because I lived through that era. But kind of getting back to Tom McCall, you talked about his AIDS, and it kind of goes back to, he had his strengths. But then he had his, I think it was Westerdahl and the other gentleman. Did you have much to do with that? But it sounds like they were kind of the organizers.
Yeah, the question was about Tom McCall and his use of staff and advisors. Tom really understood how to use staff. He had an extraordinary staff in the governor's office. Ed Westerdahl and Ron Schmidt are the ones that we normally think most of, but there were others as well, and good people. And he understood how to use them. One of the interesting things about Tom was most of the big things that we associate with him were not projects or ideas that he himself originated. Some of them came from staff, some of them came from other places. Bob Straub came up with the Willamette Greenway. Tom went out and endorsed it and took it as his own, and away he goes. He was good at that, and we all benefited from it. And he usually gave credit to others. He was good at that too. But the ability to hire and use good staff is just so important in a leader. And I've not seen many people around who could match Tom McCall on that. He listened. He was a good listener. He was he was a wonderful talker, but he was also a good listener. He would listen to staff. He'd listen to people he ran into on the street. And that's very important in a leader, that they actually listen, not just wait for a chance to a break in the conversation where they can make their speech. He was good that way. Yeah, he had wonderful staff. Excellent. Okay, we should probably call this down to a halt, and I'm going to go up and sign books if people buy them. So buy books. What the heck?
Let's go buy books. And Floyd, thanks for sharing your insights in terms of how it worked and how it can work. I really appreciate it.